I missing a button here on the slides? Sure. There we go. Is it on? Is there an on button? On the side? On the side? Ah. Now it should work. There we go. All right, so we've covered some of this stuff this morning, or last week. Just a quick reminder that we are talking about the anthropological and historical aspects of post-exilic Judea. But in order to understand what we're going to be talking about, we are going through a little bit of the background of what history and anthropology, short people have to make certain adjustments. Just learning. Hi. I can be shorter than you. But just to get a good understanding of the processes and the ideas and the overarching things that we're going to be discussing. And additionally, we are going to be talking about, this morning, we're going to continue the basic coverage of Jewish and Judean history up until post-exile. So my goal in the next couple weeks is kind of do an overarching idea or understanding of who the Judeans are. So we're going to talk about next week. We're going to talk about we're going to talk about agriculture, because people in this time and period were agriculturalists. That's how they survived. They're not mainstream. 99% of the population in Judea was not 99, but a good portion of the population in Judea at this time, and what the time period we're talking about is the late 5th century, early 4th century BCE, which is the 500s, late 500s, or last decades of the 600s BCE. That is at the time that the kingdom of Judea is conquered by the Neo-Babylonians, and they exile. What's important to understand, they exile only really the people in Jerusalem itself. It's not the entire country that gets exiled, because if you're a king and you've overtaken a country, that country still has to produce things for you. Still has to produce goods and food and people, servants, slaves. And so much of the countryside of Judea was left to do that for the Neo-Babylonians. So when we read about the exile, we're really talking about, and there were leaders in some of these smaller villages and so forth, but we're really talking about an exile of the leadership of Judea. Those rulers, those who had control over the peoples. One thing that should be understood is when I talk about things that may be in conflict for things that we have grown up learning about in the Bible, it's not an intent to dispute the Bible, and we talked about this last week briefly. This is not an attempt to disprove or to prove the Bible. What archaeologists and historians are doing is just finding out remarkably, and most of the time, what the normal people were doing. The guy who lived in Bethel, or who lived in Bethlehem, which is Bethel, or the guy who lived in the outer portions of Judea. What was their life like? Because, again, we can only know so much through the Bible. As the writers of the New Testament and the Gospels mention, and I'll be saying this often, Jesus told so many stories that they couldn't write them all down. And that was just 40 days. We're talking about a kingdom and an entire civilization that spans hundreds, if not thousands, of years. And we only have a few books that talk about that. So I'm going to go over this real quick because this is kind of where we ended the timeline of relevant Jewish history. And as I spoke, I am going to talk a little bit about prior to the exile, because we need a foundation of where we're going to be going and what we know. So at the end of the 6th century BCE, Jerusalem falls to the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and we'll talk about what Neo-Babylonian means as opposed to Babylon, and beginning the exile. Those people who were not physically removed from Jerusalem and the surrounding communities, who were not exiled directly into Babylon, Neo-Babylonia, they fled throughout the Middle East. They did not just go there. And this is important to understand, that they didn't just go to Babylon. Babylon at this time had a number of enemies, the biggest one being Egypt. So if somebody's taking people or besieging or attacking my land, I want to fight them, and I'm going to go to the place or to the people who are fighting them, who have the ability to do so. And at this time, it is Egypt. So Egypt is a very important place for them to flee to, because Egypt was not, portions of Egypt were conquered, but at this point, Egypt is still independent and not a vassal state of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Then about 10 to overall, the Persian period, we get the Persians, who actually, in 60 years after Neo-Babylonian Empire takes exiles the Judeans, the Persians, who are Iranians, as we would know them today, the Achaemenid, also known as the Achaemenid period. The Persians conquer what is left of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and they began taking over. They allow the Persians allow the Judeans to return to Jerusalem and to the Holy Land. We have the Edict of Cyrus, which is talking about the first return from exile. This is a copy of the Cyrus Cylinder. Although there was parchment and there was, not parchment, there was reed paper, most writings that we have that survive these periods are in stone. This because it lasts. It doesn't deteriorate as well as paper. Cyrus Cylinder, this is a copy that was found in ancient Persia. It is on display at the British Museum. If you ever get a chance to go to London and visit that, I could spend years there. But it does not mention Jerusalem. That does not mean that this is the only cylinder there or that existed. Again, if you've seen pictures of Athens and in Greece, you see the ruins. They're all ruined. Things are taken apart because people reuse the items. So if you find stone and you have no use for it anymore, or you don't care what it says anymore, you're going to reuse it. So there's just because this cylinder does not contain a mention of Jerusalem does not mean that there weren't other cylinders that do so. This cylinder and this decree is mentioned many times is mentioned several times in the Old Testament, Ezra, and in 2 Chronicles. And I apologize for the font. I didn't change the font until the next couple of slides. So in 520, we began the building of the Second Temple. The Second Temple was not built in one building. If you read the book of Ezra, if you read Nehemiah, you learn that there's actually a couple of builds. The first build is really just a foundation because the temple has been ruined. So you get 520 to 515, the temple is beginning to be rebuilt. 520, you have the prophet Haggai, is dated, and we'll talk about how we get that date. About 500, this development, this notion of a Messiah as a political, military, religious, moral leader develops. There was some concept, there was always, and there still is to this day, a Jewish component of the belief in a leader. We have to understand that at this point, and pretty much until the turn into the new millennium, until the common era, there is no concept of an afterlife. There is no concept of heaven in the sense that we understand it now. There was the concept of Sheol, and anybody who's studied history, it's very much similar to the concept of Hades, which is a central repository for souls and for your bodies and for your consciousness. So everything about the Jewish history, everything about the Jews themselves is about the physical, not necessarily the spiritual, because it's the physical, because they don't have this concept at this point, according to historians. They don't have this concept of an afterlife, of eternity. They have a concept of this is what God has given us. That is why we are his people. That's why this temple is important, because it is a physical representation of God here on earth. The Ark of the Covenant. It is God's footstool. It is his throne here on earth. It is a physical place for us to interact. The Holy of Holies, it's where we interact with God. Not as we have it now, where God interacts with us on a personal level. And as we'll study, the concept of God and his interactions with his people is not a personal interaction. The evidence does not demonstrate a personal relationship with God to the Jewish people at this point. It is very much a concept of the community and the people themselves, which is why there's only one day of atonement. One day a year, the high priest goes to the temple and makes atonement for the sins of the nation. Because it's very much a national God. It's very much a national entity. And if you study, historians who study and archaeologists, you see this concept of a God, who is the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, the God of Jacob, the God of Isaac. And you read in the Old Testament, when they speak of God, they speak of God, the God of Abraham, because he is a people's God. And they recognize that there's other gods around. Later on, there's this development that there are other gods, but they are not real gods. At the beginning, the belief is that the concept is that God is the God just of Israel. There are other gods, but they are the gods of other countries. And our God is more powerful. Later on, at this point, especially Second Temple Judaism, you have this growing concept of there are other gods, but they're not really gods. They're just not concepts. They're just beliefs that there's a God. but there's not really a God, which ultimately develops to there is only one God. It is the Judean God, Israeli God. And there are no other gods. All other gods are just made-up fantasies. That is a scholarly analysis of the concept of God. It's very brief, but very much so. You had a question?
No, I just wanted to comment that there obviously were some people who had personal, I mean, the characters in the Bible, such as
Very much
David.
so. Very much so. There are people in the Bible who do have this personal relationship with God. But again, as I spoke briefly earlier, this concept of what we know in the Bible is very limited. We're talking about Joe and the community 25 miles down the road. Most regular Judeans, people who were not in Jerusalem, did not have this personal concept. And we know this, we learn this, and we'll talk about this down the road, because there are other temples throughout the Mediterranean after the second temple period. There's a temple in Egypt. There's a Jewish temple in Egypt that the Jewish exiles in Egypt use to worship because they can't make it all the way to Judea. So they have this, so they go to the local temple, which slowly turns into synagogue, the concept of the synagogue. But that's really, this period of time is so important to our modern understanding of the Jewish people, because it changed who the Jews were before this. Before this, they were a kingdom, they were a nationality, they had their own thing. It's not until after this that you have this diaspora, which is not really diaspora, but an exile. And you have this spreading of Judaism throughout the Mediterranean. And they're influenced by the communities they grow up in, just like we are. I grew up in San Antonio, Texas. I lived in South Royalton, Vermont. I've lived in New York City and in DC. Living in those locations has influenced my concept of the world. Those of you who were in the military, who've been deployed or who were stationed in different locations, interacting with people from a different culture and a different community affects your mind view and your mindset. It happens here. This is not any different. They're not isolated in a bubble. They don't retain the same concepts and beliefs that the Judeans do. And that's how we get into the New Testament. Again, I'm diverting, but you have this Hellenist. We read in Acts how the Hellenistic Jews are arguing with the leaders in Jerusalem, because the Hellenistic Jews are Jews who do not live in Judea, do not live in Jerusalem. They have a slightly different worldview of Judaism than those who live in Jerusalem. And those of you who know more about the New Testament history than I do, understand that that's a conflict. You have many more Gentiles, many more converts, and I'm drawing a blank on the Jewish word for a convert to Judaism. Proselyte. A proselyte, thank you. You have many more of those outside of Jerusalem and outside of Judea than you do in Judea. And that influences the New Testament. That's why Paul goes out and speaks to these people, and he has more interaction with people who are not necessarily comfortable with circumcision, which, getting back to the history, is the one concept of Judaism that does not change. the circumcision. And it becomes a problem in the 200s BCE, and part of the reason why the Jews under the Persian Empire revolt, because there's an attempt by the Persians and by the Egyptians, who are in control at that time, to stop the circumcision. And the leaders in Judea, the leaders in Jerusalem, say, okay, yeah, we don't need the circumcision. So you get a revolt, the Hasmonean revolt. That's one of the number of reasons, and we'll talk about that. Getting back to our timeline before I get further down the road. So you have this notion of the Messiah starts to really develop as we know it around 500 BCE. That's influenced by the interactions that they have with other communities, other cultures. You have a Reformation led by Ezra and Nehemiah. The big Reformation is restoring the temple. Does anybody know what the other big issue in Ezra and Nehemiah is that they identify? I like interacting with people, so that's why I do ask questions. Purity. Let's get rid of all the foreign wives. We cannot have foreign wives having half Judean children. There's an emphasis in Ezra and Nehemiah, if you go back and read it, about how we need to purify the Judean population. It doesn't work, just letting you know. But there's an overt message in Ezra and Nehemiah. You have the Torah. Finally, we're getting a compilation of the Old Testament. We start with the Pentateuch. Okay, the first 5 books, the law, and the beginning. That starts to get compiled. There is evidence that these stories abound, that they are written in some form. We don't have really good evidence of what it looked like prior to around this time. What we know that these stories were both oral and most likely written down in some form. 438, Ahasuerus becomes king of Persia. That becomes important just because he starts to give a little bit more money to Judeans. He also loses part of his kingdom. 426, we talk about Haman and Esther. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then we talk about Haman's sons, the Megillah, which becomes, if you're not aware, the Jews have a lot of festivals. It's important to them because, as I mentioned earlier, they are a today people, not a future kingdom, eternity people. So we're going to celebrate what God has given us now because we're about the flesh, about the people, about the things we have today in our lives. 411, Bagoas is made governor of Jerusalem. He is a Persian. He is not a Jew. And this becomes an issue. This is where we really start to see leadership that is not Jewish. We start to see leadership that is very much from the temple. Because if you really think about it, before this time, who were the leaders of Judea? Nope.
Whoever the king said was.
You had the king. The king was the ruler of Judea, not the priest. The priest's sole job was to protect the temple and make the sacrifices. The Levites were to support them. Who did we have before the kings? The judges. Again, not the priests, though some judges were priests. Some priests were judges. But it was very much a separation, for all intents and purposes, a separation of powers. You had the religious rulers, and you had the earthly rulers. You had the kings, and why did we have kings?
They asked for it.
Because they asked for it. For Samuel. They asked for this. I didn't want to give it to you, but you asked for it, so here you go. And it worked for 2 generations, David and Solomon. and we kind of had a problem. Okay? So, get to the 300s. Now the things start to really roll, and we have a lot more evidence, archaeological and historical evidence, at this point moving forward. What happens in 333? Alexander the Great, Alexander the Macedonian. He's not really Greek. He's probably Romanian, Montenegrin, Balkan. He is not a Greek. They call it the Greeks because the Greeks were actually the most powerful of the states in that point. He conquered Athens, and then from Athens he goes out and conquers the rest of the world. He conquers Israel between 333 and 331. He doesn't change anything. He doesn't change a lot. There is a great book, and I can't remember the name of it, and we'll talk about it when we get to that point, where that talks about Alexander's one visit to Jerusalem. And it's an interesting prose on that. Then about 10 years later, you get Judaism under the Greek, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Ptolemies are Egyptians. So Alexander the Great conquers Egypt as well. Those kings become vassal kings under the Hellenistic period. And they are now in control of the land of Judea. Then a little bit later on, they lose power, and the Syrians, the Seleucids, take power. So Seleucids are Syrians from Assyria, not Syria, Assyria, which is portion of Syria, but also Turkey and going up around the Caspian Sea area. And so you get that 300s to 168. About 250, the Septuagint is translated from Hebrew, High Hebrew, which is biblical Hebrew, into Greek. Yes, sir?
Yes, question. What happens there at 333 in that category, 63, Hellenistic period, but it wasn't until 33.1 that Alexander the Great conquered. Is there some type of movement that means that Greece or the folks that are Greek are actually coming into Jerusalem, Israel?
That's part of it. So when the Greeks conquer Judea, they bring their culture.
Yeah,
but
that's not until a little later. I was just wondering what happens during that 32 years.
So we got 333 to 63. That's the overall Greek period. So the Greeks have some major influence. After the Greek influence, you get the Roman influence. So that's kind of why it just says 33 to 63. The next one says 333 to /331 BCE. So in those 2 years, Alexander conquers all of the Levant. So that includes Judea, the remnants of Israel, Moab, Ammon, and so forth.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then, so 230, the Romans start coming in. They are not conquering, but they start to come into the eastern portion of the Mediterranean. 201, we start getting the compilation of the prophetic writings. It is a portion of Jewish scripture that becomes important to the Jews at this point because they're trying to figure out, okay, when are we going to get back to the kingdom of Judea? 200 to 135 CE, you have the Qumran community. It's a group of people who decided, hey, we don't like the way the priests are running the temple, because at this point, the priests are not Davidic or Aaronic line priests. These are priests that are set up by the controlling government. So they're not descendants of Aaron. They are not fulfilling the scriptures. So the Qumran community separates, says, we're going to do our own thing. And they make a bunch of writings that we found about 80 years ago now, called the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we'll talk about that when we get to that. Seleucid in 175, the Seleucid king of Syria plunders Jerusalem, kills many. In 166, you have the Maccabean revolt. These are Jews who, rural Jews, not from Jerusalem, the Maccabees, and we'll talk about the book of Maccabees 1 and 2, and we'll talk about the revolt and how they reestablish some of Judea. But they don't reestablish, again, they don't reestablish the Aaronic line, Aaronic, A-A-R-O-N-I-C, the Aaron line, the line of Aaron, to the priesthood or to the Levites. This is more of a power grab, and they become leaders. They become priests. So by the time we get to the New Testament, by the time we get to Jesus, the time of Jesus, these priests, the high priest of Israel, is not a descendant of Aaron. He's actually a descendant of the Maccabees, because the Maccabeans become, and their families and their people become the temple priests. And we're going to talk a lot about that. And then 142 to 129, you have the Jewish autonomy under the Hasmoneans. From 129 to 63, there's this interplay between power struggles. And I'm going to speed up through this real quick because we do have a few more slides to get to. Rome annexes the land of Israel in 63 BCE. At this point, Rome has had enough of the issues that are occurring, not just in Jerusalem, not just in Judea, but throughout the Near East. And says, enough, we're going to install people we like. That being said, they do not install procurators. That does not happen until after the death of Herod Antipas and his line. At this point, it's just, we're going to pick your king. So the leaders are no longer the priests, they are back to the king. And Israel or Judea is a vassal state, which means that they are under the control of Rome, under the protection of Rome. So if the Persians, who are still a kingdom, decide to come and attack Israel, Rome will provide support for that. 63 to 73 CE, you have the first Jewish revolt. Jews are said, okay, look, we were on our own for a while. We like it. We don't like you anymore, Rome. Get out of our hair. They're not successful. The temple burns. The temple is destroyed in 70 through Titus, who is Vespasian's son. He comes, Vespasian, who's the emperor at the time, comes down and says, I'm going to send Titus to siege Jerusalem, and he does. And then you have the end of the temple, the second temple period. 45 to 150 CE, we have the writing and compilation of the text that we later include, the majority of the text that we later include in the Christian New Testament canon. Maybe. We'll talk about that briefly according to scholarship. Finally, the Bible isn't actually compiled until 1500s. Before that, yes, we had, you have the Vulgate, you have different Bibles, but they also have different books in them, some that we don't recognize anymore as canonical. So it's not until around the 1500s, after Martin Luther and honestly the Catholic Church said, look, we got to make sure that we know what's Catholic, what is canonical. And they made it a final list. And then Martin Luther comes around and says, no, this is the final list. And they're different to this day. So, foundational information. What's important to understand in the 500s, late 500s, late 600s, is that by the end of the First Temple period, which ended around 586 BCE, the walled city of ancient Jerusalem approximately covered 160 acres. Anybody a farmer or have land? 160 acres is really not that big. But it was a large city at that point because it had about 8,000 people. By the time the settlement had extended northward outside of the city walls, which also expanded the city. At the height, the population of Jerusalem at the end of the 8th century, so the end of the 700s, according to scholars, was around 8,000. How do we know? Because, and we'll talk about this in detail. The size of the city, there are people who study population, and part of the way they study it is you have a city, you have a certain geographical size, and how much of that size can support X amount of people based on agriculture, water, the size and shapes of homes. Those things come together to give scholars an estimate of the size of the population. As a result of the siege of Jerusalem by the Assyrian monarch in 701, ancient Jerusalem's population declined to about 6,000, and it remained so until the Babylonians destroyed the city in 586 and forced much of the population to exile. People are going to say, wait, I thought Jerusalem didn't fall until 586. Why was there a population decline, and who's this Sennacherib? Sennacherib was the Assyrian monarch who destroyed the northern kingdom. He didn't just affect the northern kingdom. It affected the southern kingdom, Judah, Simeon, and Benjamin as well. Okay? They lost people. In addition, when we talk about the diaspora, yes, many people spread and left and moved on, but a large population of the northern kingdoms came south and moved into the kingdom of Judea. So even though Jerusalem shrinks, the population of Judea itself expands. And how do we know this? Again, these are the people who are doing population studies. They look at these small communities, especially in northern Judea, and they see a population growth. And they see these new communities, these new foundations, these new buildings, these new communities being developed at around this time, around the late 600s. So, after the Babylonian destruction, the few inhabitants who remained in the city, so now we're talking back again at 586, who lived primarily in the old area, the city of David. The city of David itself, and we'll talk about this, at the most was about 10 acres. So if you look at ancient Jerusalem, and I apologize, we'll talk about this more when we talk about Jerusalem itself. The city of Jerusalem is inside a walled area, okay? It's about 10 acres. The city of David is actually kind of like a suburb. It's actually outside of the walls to the west, to the east. This is, so the city of David itself is kind of like the regional, it's kind of like DC. So where you have the capital, you have the temple, and you have the government buildings. Then you have the city of David, which is kind of where Joe, the worker who supports the city, lives. So the city of David is about 10 acres at the most. So after the Persians took control of Jerusalem from the Babylonians, and this is another 70 years down the road, so 530s, and they allowed the Judeans to come back. Ancient Jerusalem became the capital of the Persian province of Yehud. That's the Persians called Judea Yehud. just a different dialect. Yehud, though we think some scholars, and 50 years ago this was the prevailing thought, was that Jerusalem was the capital. Studies now believe that the capital of Jerusalem itself, upon the return of the Judeans after the exile, was a city called Ramat Rahel. Ramat Rahel is about 5-7 miles south of Jerusalem. There are excavations in the area, and we'll talk about the excavations that indicate that it was actually the administrative center of Yehud during the Persian period. Jerusalem continued to be confined really to the city of David because there was nothing there. There was nothing in Jerusalem. The temple had been destroyed. So people didn't really live in Jerusalem. They lived in the city of David, which is right outside the walls. And it had generally a population about 400 to 800.
That's a lot.
For 10 acres, that is a huge community. But it is the numbers are vastly different than what we get in the Old Testament scriptures. And I don't have the answer as to why that big of a discrepancy off the top of my head. Something I will present to you guys, what the scholarly analysis is. But again, this is all based on excavations and what it appears that the site, the area could support at that time. Now, does that mean that when the Bible says 10,000 or whatever the number is off the top of my head, I can't remember, return to Jerusalem? They could have returned to the area of Jerusalem, to the communities all throughout that area to help rebuild the temple. Yes, sir?
I'm sorry, I missed the number of acres in Jerusalem.
10. Oh, before?
Yeah.
Was roughly, was it 60?
60.
Was it 80?
That was 150.
160. 160 acres. That's the city of Jerusalem. The city of David itself, which is like the little suburb, is about 10 acres. And there's some really great, if you Google City of David, you will get some really great, there's some really great pictures out there of what the sites look like. It's really small. Because again, this is an agricultural community in the 500s. This is not a bustling metropolis. Literacy. We're going to talk about this, and then this will be it for today. Literacy. It's important for us to understand that scholars place literacy and the ability to read at around 3% throughout the world at this time. Again, I talked about this briefly last week. It's why we had scribes. Scribes were oftentimes priests, and this continues on into the New Testament period, into the medieval times. It's the monks and the people who live in these secluded areas that are doing the writings. For the longest time, the priest, the people didn't understand. They came to temple, they came and they listened because they couldn't read. That being said, and more so, Hebrew at this point is a scholarly language. It is not the same Hebrew that people today speak. This is a biblical Hebrew, and it's very technical, which is why a lot of times when we're reading the New Testament or the Old Testament, we sometimes read that and it sounds jilted. Some of these passages sound disjointed. A lot of it has to do with the fact that this is a very scholarly language, written language, because it's for the priests. They're the only ones who need to know this. Joe, the commoner, doesn't need to know about the temple sacrifices. He just needs to know that he needs to bring what he needs to bring and when he has to bring it. That can be passed on orally. The temple prayers, the temple, actions, the rules, those have to be written down so that they can be passed on, so people don't make mistakes down the road. Yes, sir.
What was the language? If only 3% at most during the relevant times could read, what was the relevant language?
Semitic,
Semitic. Okay.
which is it's just kind of what develops, part of it develops into what we know as Aramaic, which is the common language of the area and probably what Jesus spoke at that time, because it was the common language.
So is that really saying only 3% could read Hebrew? Right?
Well, they just couldn't read, period.
Now that's a hard figure to believe.
It is, but if you think about the
I
United
think
States
about
population,
the Hebrew people, the children of Israel, and the way they were educated throughout the time spectrum, everything we're talking about, it's hard to believe figure. That's
It is.
my opinion.
No, I get that. Most people do not speak Hebrew, other than the Levitical priestly class. Even the rulers rarely read. Most Jews could write their name. That was the limit of their ability to read and write. Again, this comes back to, this is an agricultural class of people. They don't have the time to spend to go to school. When you are living season by season, day by day, to have food, protect your crops, and protect yourself from foreigners, the parents would rather spend the time sending their kids to the fields to work than to read. Doesn't mean that they didn't know the stories. Does not mean that these oral traditions were not passed on, because that's primarily where we get most of our stories. They don't get written down until that becomes a convenience. Literacy is, again, at this point, the ability to write is not as important as the ability to speak and to do.
The children were required to go to synagogue school until they were, 11 or 12.
Not at this time.
Synagogue school was not.
There was no school. Synagogues do not start springing up until the late first century CE or BCE. So you don't have a synagogue. There is only one temple at this point. There is no local church. There's no local synagogues. There's none of that until around 60, until the Romans come in.
60 BC?
BC. There is no synagogue. Yes, sir.
I've often wondered the number of times at the literacy level of those in the Civil War,
Mm-hmm.
and then even far back as Europe, in the cathedrals
Mm-hmm.
all over Europe, were decorated and adorned with stories to help people understand the process, the idea behind the Lord.
But if you look at these temples, you look at these synagogues, you look at these ancient cathedrals, how much writing is on the walls? Actual letters and words. Our art master.
Pictures,
It's all pictures.
telling the story. They could read the iconography.
Is it Duro Iopis or Iopis Duro, the oldest house church that was in Syria that was found. There is no writing in that house church, only pictures. Pictures of the Good Shepherd, pictures of Jesus carrying the lamb over his shoulders. There's not letters, there's not words, because again, unfortunately, the way the scholars, and I tend to agree, the ability to read was very limited. And we're going to leave it at this. Last question.
I take back it's not a question.
Okay.
It's a retrieval. I'm trying to, I'm trying to rear horror here.
No.
After you brought this up with Kim about the 60 BC, and we didn't have but just one temple. We didn't have what we were experiencing from the New Testament, as far as the upbringing of the children.
Right.
That I take back. I can believe that 3% the more I think about it,
Yeah.
and so I want to take
And
that comment back.
And just closing, majority of those people are found in Jerusalem. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was gonna Jerusalem and the whole world, when you're talking about from this perspective, it would feel much smaller than 3% because it was concentrated. You go to any one of these rural communities, tiny, tiny fraction. It's not like pick 100 random people and find 3 of them.
Right.
It was all concentrated to the metro areas and the scholarly,
Or to the Levite. If you had the one Levite who lived in your city, that Levite may have been the only educated person to talk to you about the stories. But he probably didn't have anything in writing because it's so expensive and it's so time consuming and it's so hard to just keep that in play. We'll talk more about this next week. I promise you it's going to get more exciting and more controversial.
Thank you.
You're welcome.